Hey everybody, how are you? Welcome to another terrific Tuesday with WT and some English. We are completely switching gears. We have finished Lord of the Flies, which took us quite some time, but hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you've gotten your work into me. Just to start off with some points of interest, I log everything on my paper here, including times that I hear from you and times that I email you, and your assignments, whether they're done or not. And finally, for 2 weeks ago, I got most of the assignments from all of the classes. There's still about 5 in each class that don't have it in. But from last week, you had to hand in your study guide, either through a note from a parent or sending me pictures. And only about, excuse me, only about 7 of you have done that from each class. And then the raft assignment, which is kind of like the final exam, the final assessment for Lord of the Flies, that was also due, and I've only gotten on average about 7 from each class for those. So that's about a third of each class have turned in the work that's owed for this week, and it was due today. I will accept it late. It just makes things difficult when I have to do all of the planning for Tuesday and then grading work that is a week old. My suggestion for you is to really spend Tuesdays on English. That's English Day. I post a video between 35 and 45 minutes long, and there's one assignment and some reading, or 2 assignments. Each assignment is designed to be very short, and so I would guess that the assignments that I'm going to talk about today will probably take you between 30 and 40 minutes for each one. So that is less than 2 hours for your English work. Plus the video, we're looking at less than 3 hours of work for English. If you get that done on Tuesday, it's going to make your life easier. It's going to make my life easier, and the life of your parents and guardians easier. Because what happens is I have to send emails and phone calls out to you 3 times in a week. If I don't hear from you, then I have to send your name forward to administration, and then they meet and discuss what they're going to do about it. Some students have now been assigned a teaching assistant to help them with their work every day, and hopefully that is going to work for those students. So with that said, please try to keep on top of everything. Some of you already owe 3 assignments, and I'm going to throw 2 more at you today that are due next week. So good luck with that. I am always available for questions. Don't hesitate to ask them. Don't hesitate to reach out. We can set up a time to talk on the phone or do a Zoom call if you need extra assistance. So, okay, so let's get started. Got a lot going on. Like I said, we're switching gears. We're going to be starting a 5-week poetry unit. This is something that we have to do in 10th grade anyway, and I think it'll go well with virtual learning because a lot of it is independent work that you can do. But I have some handouts here that I want to go through with you. Excuse me. Sorry about that. Just like class. Never know when I have to sneeze. A little hand sanitizer. So the first thing that we're going to do is our daily discovery, and we have been doing illusions, and this is illusion number 6. I'm going to remind you what an illusion is, and then we're going to talk about illusion number 6. So an illusion is when an author or poet makes an indirect reference to some idea, figure, other text or place that originates from outside of the text. It could also refer to something that happens earlier in the text. That's often called an internal illusion. The verb form of the noun illusion is to allude. So you could state that a writer alludes to or makes an allusion to something. For instance, it's particularly common for writers from the West to make allusions in their works to the Bible or Greek or Roman mythology. Allusions are subtle and indirect, hinting at something you're expected to know without explicitly telling you what it is. The literary device is used to enhance the text. So allusion number 6 is called Icarus. And if you're at all familiar with mythology, you'll be familiar with this allusion of Daedalus and Icarus. So Icarus was the young son of a guy named Daedalus. And Daedalus was one of King Minos' servants and top inventors. Daedalus and Icarus were imprisoned by King Minos for treason. Daedalus was smart and inventive, so he started thinking how he and Icarus could escape the tower that they were imprisoned in. The only way out was the air. Daedalus managed to create gigantic wings using branches and connecting them with wax. He taught Icarus to fly, but told him to keep away from the sun because the heat would make the wax melt, destroying the wings. Daedalus and Icarus managed to escape the tower, and they flew to the sky free. Although he had warned Icarus was too young and too enthusiastic about flying, he got excited and carried away by the thrill of flying and the amazing feeling of freedom. He started flying high to salute the sun and diving low to the sea and then high again. His father Daedalus was trying in vain to make young Icarus understand that his behavior was dangerous, and Icarus soon saw his wings melting. Icarus fell into the sea and died. The Icaran Sea where he fell was named after him, and then there's also a nearby small island called Icaria. So the meaning of the allusion Icarus is that when people say this, when they allude to Icarus, it's often to say that someone is being too ambitious or not listening to good advice of others. If Icarus had listened to his father and acknowledged his own limits, he would have escaped prison safely. Instead, he got arrogant and pushed beyond his capabilities, leading to his downfall. You might also hear the phrase, "he flew too high to the sun," in songs or in television shows, and that's also an allusion to Icarus. So that is our allusion of the day. So like I said, we're switching to poetry, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what poetry is. And there is a video that is about 5 minutes long about poetry that you'll be watching in your content chunk along with this video. So once you watch this video, watch the poetry video afterwards. But I was thinking about what defines poetry and what is poetry, and it's so different than a novel and so different than a play that we've read, and it's different than non-fiction texts. And perhaps the characteristic most central to the definition of poetry is its unwillingness to be defined, to be labeled, to be nailed down. Poetry is chiseled marble of language. It is paint-spattered canvas, but the poet uses words instead of paint. And the canvas is you. Poetic definitions of poetry kind of spiral in on themselves, however, like a dog eating itself from the tail up. In fact, we can render an accessible definition of poetry by simply looking at its form and its purpose. One of the most definable characteristics of poetry is the form of economy of language. What does that mean? I like to say that poetry says more using less, so it economizes on words. Poets are miserly and unrelentingly critical in the way that they dole out words. Carefully selecting words for conciseness and clarity is standard, even for writers of all kinds. However, poets go well beyond this, considering a word's emotive qualities, the word's backstory, the word's musical value, or its double or triple entendres, and even its spatial relationship on the page. The poet, through innovation in both word choice and form, seemingly rends significance from thin air. One may use prose to narrate. When I say the word prose is anything that is not poetry. So if it's written in sentence form, like a novel, that's prose. So one may use prose to narrate, describe, argue, or define. There are equally numerous reasons for writing poetry, but poetry often has an underlying and overarching purpose that goes beyond the literal, the surface. Poetry is evocative. It typically provokes the reader an intense emotion like joy or sorrow or anger or love. It has the ability to surprise the reader with an aha moment and to give revelation, insight, or further understanding of elemental truth and beauty. Keats said, and Keats was a poet, "Beauty is truth, truth, beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know." So do we have a definition yet? Let's sum it up like this. Poetry is artistically rendered words in such a way as to evoke intense motion or an aha experience from the reader, being economical with language and often writing in a set form. Boiling it down like that doesn't seem to satisfy the nuances of poetry, the rich history or the work that goes into selecting each word, phrase, metaphor, or punctuation mark to craft a written piece of poetry, but it's a start. It's difficult to shackle poetry down with a definition. It's not old, frail, and cerebral, meaning of the mind. Poetry is stronger and fresher than you think. Poetry is imagination, and will break those chains faster than you can say Harlem Renaissance, which is a poetry movement. To borrow a phrase, poetry is a riddle wrapped in an enigma, swathed in a cardigan sweater, or something like that. An ever-evolving genre, it will shirk definitions at every turn. That continual evolution keeps it alive. Its inherent challenges to doing it well and its ability to get at the core of emotion or learning keeps people reading it and writing it. The writers are just the first ones to have the aha moments as they're putting their words on pages. So that's a little bit about what poetry is or isn't. And within poetry lies so many different kinds of poetry. And for the next 5 weeks, we are choosing to focus on different kinds of poetry. And the first kind of poetry that I'm talking about today is narrative poetry. Narrative means it has a narrator. Narrator means it's telling a story. And why I wanted to start with that one is because during this time of the coronavirus, we all have so many stories to tell. And I'd like to encourage you to keep a journal during this time period so you can look back on your life at the time that you were a teenager and in quarantine and social isolation, and write your thoughts down about that. I wish I could give that as an assignment, but I give it as an extra credit assignment. How's that? So we're talking about narrative poetry. I'm going to read some examples of narrative poetry, including one that I wrote yesterday, and then I'm going to explain the homework to you. Make sure that you listen to the end of the video because I will explain the homework, and that way you won't have to ask me questions that I'm explaining in the video. So narrative poetry tells stories through verse. Verse is the way that poetry is written as opposed to prose. Like a novel or a short story, a narrative poem has a plot, has characters, and it has a setting. It uses a range of poetic techniques such as rhyme and meter. Narrative poetry presents a series of events, often including action and dialogue. In most cases, narrative poems only have one speaker, the narrator, who relates the entire story from beginning to end. For example, I do believe we did this year. We read Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven. I remember reading it out loud to you. It's narrated by a grieving man who, over the course of 18 stanzas, and remember a stanza is like a paragraph in a poem, it's a measurement of length, describes his mysterious confrontation with a raven and his descent into despair. So the earliest forms of narrative poetry wasn't written, but it was spoken. It was recited, it was chanted, it was sung, Before language was written down, people told stories through poetry around the campfire as a form of entertainment. And would you believe that what you read last year, the Odyssey, was actually a poem that was recited out loud through something we call oral tradition or oral formulaic tradition? They would have a formula for their stories to remember so they wouldn't forget specific parts. So poetic devices like rhyme, rhythm, and repetition made those stories easier to memorize so they could be transported long distances and handed down from generation to generation. Narrative poetry evolved from this oral tradition. In nearly every part of the world, narrative poetry established a foundation for other literary forms. The example among the highest achievements of the ancient Greece are the Iliad and the Odyssey, which have inspired artists and writers for more than 2,000 years. And again, you read the Odyssey last year. Ancient and medieval narrative poems were most commonly called epics. Written in a grandiose style, these epic narrative poems retold legends of virtuous heroes and powerful gods. Other traditional forms of narrative include Arthurian romances about knights and chivalry, and ballads about love, heartbreak, and dramatic events. However, narrative poetry is an ever-evolving art, and there are countless other ways to tell stories through verse. So I have 3 examples. One I'm going to read in full, one I'm going to read partially, and then one is the one that I've written. So I'll read these examples of what a narrative poem is, because you'll be reading a narrative poem on your own for homework and doing some exercises, and you'll also be writing your own narrative poem. So let's get started at that. This first one is super famous, and you may have heard it when you were a kid, but since it's kind of baseball season, I thought I'd dig it out. It's called Casey at Bat, and it was written by a man named Ernest Lawrence Thayer, and it was written in 1888, so a long time ago. And he recited this poem throughout his life 15,000 times, and it just kept getting more and more popular. So let's get started. It is long. Narrative poems tell a story, and sometimes the stories are long. But I want you to notice the use of rhyme, rhythm, and repetition. The outlook wasn't brilliant for the Mudville 9 that day. The score stood 4-2, with but 1 inning more to play. And then when Cooney died at first and Barrows did the same, a pall-like silence fell upon the patrons of the game. A straggling few got up to go in deep despair. The rest clung to the hope which springs eternal in the human breast. They thought, if only Casey could but get a whack at that, we'd put up money now with Casey at the bat. But Flynn preceded Casey, as did also Jimmy Blake, and the former was a Lulu, while the latter was a cake. So upon that stricken multitude grim melancholy sat, for there seemed to be but little chance of getting Casey at the bat. But Flynn let drive a single to the wonderment of all, and Blake, the much despised, tore the cover off the ball. And when the dust had lifted, and the men saw what had occurred, there was Jimmy safe at second, and Flynn a hugging third. Then from 5,000 throats and more there rose a lusty yell. It rumbled through the valley, it rattled through the dell. It pounded on the mountain and recoiled upon the flat, for Casey, mighty Casey, was advancing to the bat. There was an ease in Casey's manner as he stepped into his place. There was a pride in Casey's bearing, and a smile lit Casey's face. And when, responding to the cheers, he lightly doffed his hat, no stranger in the crowd could doubt 'twas Casey at the bat. 10,000 eyes were on him as he rubbed his hands with dirt. 5,000 tongues applauded when he wiped them on his shirt. Then, while the writhing pitcher ground the ball into his hip, defiance flashed in Casey's eye, a sneer curled Casey's lip. And now the leather-covered spear came hurtling through the air, and Casey stood a-watching it in a haughty grandeur there. Close by the sturdy batsman, the ball unheeded sped. "That ain't my style," said Casey. "Strike one," the umpire said. From the benches with people there went up a muffled roar, like the beating of the storm waves on a stern and distant shore. "Kill him! Kill the umpire!" shouted someone on the stand, and it's likely they'd have killed him had not Casey raised his hand. With a smile of Christian charity, great Casey's visage shone. He stilled the rising tumult. He bade the game go on. He signaled to the pitcher, and once more the dun sphere flew. But Casey still ignored it, and the umpire said, "Strike two." "Fraud!" cried the maddened thousands, and echo answered, "Fraud!" But one scornful look from Casey, and the audience was awed. They saw his face grow stern and cold. They saw his muscles strain, and they knew that Casey wouldn't let the ball go by again. The sneer has fled from Casey's lip. His teeth are clenched in hate. He pounded with cruel violence his bat upon the plate. And now the pitcher holds the ball, and now he lets it go. And now the air is shattered by the force of Casey's blow. Oh, somewhere in this favored land, the sun is shining bright. The band is playing somewhere, and somewhere hearts are light. And somewhere men are laughing, and little children shout. But there is no joy in Mudville. Great Casey has struck out. Casey. Not bad for coming from 1888, huh? So that's a narrative poem. That's an example of one. It told a story. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. Had some conflict. There was some dialogue. The next one is called The Spell of the Yukon. And I'm going to read the introduction to this. It says, in 1904, while working for a Canadian bank, Robert Service was transferred to a place called Whitehorse, a small town in the Yukon, a northern Canadian province bordering Alaska and known for its extreme cold. During the Yukon Gold Rush of 1896, the town had served as a campground for some of the more than 100,000 prospectors who flooded the Yukon searching for gold. Service took part in the town's social life, including reciting poetry. Eventually he started composing his own poems, which were narrative poems about the gold rush. The Spell of the Yukon was published in 1907. So this is about the same length as Casey at the Bat, but I'm just going to read the first two stanzas and the last two stanzas to give you an idea of what it sounds like. The Spell of the Yukon. I wanted the gold, and I sought it. I scrabbled and mucked like a slave. Was it famine or scurvy I fought it? I hurled my youth into a grave. I wanted the gold, and I got it. Came out with a fortune last fall. Yet somehow life's not what I thought it, and somehow the gold isn't all. No, there's the land. Have you seen it? It's a Custis land that I know, from the big dizzy mountains that screen it to the deep death-like valleys below. Some say God was tired when he made it. Some say it's a fine land to shun. Maybe, but there's some as would trade it for no land on earth, and I'm one. That's the first two stanzas. And the last two stanzas. They're making my money diminish. I'm sick of the taste of champagne. Thank God, when I'm skinned to a finish, I'll pike to the Yukon again. I'll fight, and you bet it's no sham fight, it's hell. And I've been here before. And it's better than this by a damn sight. So me for the Yukon once more. There's gold, and it's haunting, and haunting. It's luring me on as of old. Yet it isn't the gold that I'm wanting, so as much as just finding the gold. It's the great big broad land way up yonder. It's the forest where silence has lease. It's the beauty that thrills me with wonder. It's the stillness that fills me with peace. So that's a story about a guy who goes to near Alaska looking for gold and finds it. But he finds that it's actually not the gold that's holding him, but it's the search for the gold. Interesting, huh? So the last example that I'm going to read you of a narrative poem, and I wanted you to see one that was more contemporary, and actually one that I wrote, because if I'm going to have you write the poems, I'm going to write them too. And I actually called this one Corona Curry. And if you don't know what curry is Indian food. It's typically spicy, can have meat in it or not. I happened to make a lentil curry yesterday, and it inspired me to write this poem. And see if you can tell how I was feeling yesterday based on the language that I choose in my story. So here's my narrative poems. And mine doesn't rhyme, and they don't have to. I flopped my right leg out of the covers, followed slowly by the left. Sitting up, I sighed. Another day to plod through with cement slippers. I got ready for my day, forced myself to do a half an hour of yoga. It was akin to running a marathon for some. I felt accomplished. Downing a smoothie, I took my coffee up to the office and began to grade and document and research and plan. I attended meetings and emailed parents, students, teachers, administrators. I finished my coffee and sighed again. Stopping for a break, I walked the dog down the same road I've been walking her every day. The black flies were swarming, but it felt good to be moving. Maybe I'll actually get in my 10,000 steps. Back to the office I go. I turn on the diffuser, the salt lamp, the fountain. I need all the vibes. I plugged away, tying up loose ends of the day, trying to feel connected to the big picture, while secretly feeling very alone. Talking to my friends, I know we all feel like this, a part of something together, but very separate. I'd put a lentil curry in the crock pot and served it for dinner over rice. It was filling and spicy and satisfying. I had seconds. I went to my bedroom to read for a while, but instead shut my eyes. I was suddenly very weary of it all. I woke with a start, and it was dark. I knew I wouldn't sleep tonight. I went to check my emails to see if any students had turned in work. I hope they did. I hope they all did. I wish I could serve them all some curry. It was the best part of my day. So what kind of mood was I in? Not a very good one. Not necessarily a bad one either. Just kind of tired and defeated and sad, I guess. Corona can make me sad sometimes. There's a lot of things that I miss, and that means I miss your faces too, being in the classroom, our laughter. So I've read you 3 examples of narrative poems. If you want me to send you any of those narrative poems as an example, I can do that, or you can just look them up online, examples of narrative poems. But I'm going to go over the homework now. I said it at the beginning, I'll say it again now. You have 2 homework assignments. In the past, when we were doing Lord of the Flies, your independent, independent reading and practice was reading the chapters of Lord of the Flies. Since we're not reading a novel, you'll have a different independent practice. So you have an independent practice and you have a choice exploration assignment. So that means 2 assignments each week, and that'll go this way until June. So you'll have to make sure that you get those to me as soon as possible. The first one is, there is a poem called Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe. You see that? Oh, it's backwards. Everyone has to read the poem. So there's a separate Word document for the poem. Everyone has to read the poem. And then one of the choices is to answer 10 comprehension questions about the poem. And the other one is to illustrate the poem. And I'm not going to read the comprehension questions to you, but I will read the directions for the illustration of the poem. So just to clarify, one assignment that everyone has to do. Everyone reads the poem, and then you choose, do I do the comprehension questions or do I do the illustration of the poem? Okay, so for illustrating the poem, you have to choose an image from the poem, or you can illustrate the whole poem. You can illustrate it by drawing a scene in color, or purposefully using black and white, not just using black and white because that's all you have, to depict your interpretation of the poem, creating a comic strip of the poem, drawing a page from a graphic novel for the poem, generating an illustration on the computer, or actually creating a collage from the computer or on paper that we're calling Love and Loss. If you choose to do this assignment, please make sure that you take your time and it reflects the work of a 10th grade student. I'm still getting some illustrations that look very juvenile, and I understand that not everyone is an artist, but I can tell the difference if you took your time with something and you didn't. And if you're really not into the creative process, then I would choose to do the comprehension questions. We tried to design our assignments to appeal to all learning styles, and hopefully there's something there that you will find appealing. So that's the first assignment on Annabel Lee. And the last assignment you'll be doing on your own is writing your own narrative poem. And you saw mine. Mine was a story about my day, getting out of bed, doing work, going for a walk, taking a nap, making some lentil curry, and going back to work again. It wasn't an exciting story, but it was my story. It was my narrative. So you're going to write your own narrative poem, and the handout looks like this, and it will be included in Schoology. You're going to write a narrative poem about any story of your choosing. Your poem needs to tell a story. There should be at least one clear character. I was the character in my narrative, a conflict, and a plot that the reader can follow. You're going to use literary devices like characterization, dialogue, imagery, personification, hyperbole. When I said I wore cement slippers, that was hyperbole to sort of indicate my depressive state. And it has to be at least 15 lines long. Tips to get you started: you'll choose a topic. It can be something that really happened or something that you made up. It can be a memory, a family legend, it can be a dream. The narrator doesn't have to be you. The narrator can be a character of your choice. Make your voice heard, meaning that you're trying to get across a specific emotion through your poem, and you want to do that through your language and through the way that you say things in your poem. Skip the build-up. Don't waste time on introduction. You really just jump in to a narrative poem. Like, I didn't give an introduction with my poem. Mine just started with me swinging my legs out of bed. Show, don't tell. Okay, the best narrative poems use imagery and descriptive words that bring out the details and paint a rich picture. think of the 5 sentences and use adjectives that help to describe words with sounds, smells, tastes, and feels so the story unfolds. So that's that. Okay, so your new unit is poetry. This week we're focusing on narrative poetry, which is storytelling. You are going to write your own narrative poem. That's one assignment. Get it to me as soon as possible. And your second assignment is to read the narrative poem Annabelle Lee, answer 10 comprehension questions, or illustrate the poem. All of the work, including the 2 videos from this week, will take you less than 3 hours to do. So, Tuesday is English Day. I suggest you wake up, you watch the video, you start your homework, you get your homework done, and then you turn it into me. And that way I won't have to send you 3 emails, email your parents, call you or call your parents, and send your name to administration, because that just gets messy, doesn't it? I miss you all. Next week we are doing poetry. I forget which kind we chose, but tune in. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.